Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Diep was kidnapped by John, escaped through the forest, and is now walking over 150 kilometers on her own to return to James, the man who has been silently waiting for her. But will her journey home be smooth, or are there more challenges waiting along the way? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss touching and inspiring stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The streetlight flickered above her like a pulse running out of rhythm. Diep sat hunched on a cold bench, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The bruised dusk had long bled into night, and the world passed her by, shadows in a hurry, eyes that never stopped. Her shoes were caked in dust, her hair tangled with wind and dried tears. She had walked so far she lost count, only that Tu Diep was now 150 kilometers behind her, and behind felt like a lifetime ago. A stranger's voice pierced the silence. "Why are you crying here?" Diep looked up. A woman, late 30s maybe, wearing a plain blouse and concern in her eyes, crouched beside her. I slept here last night. I didn't have anywhere else. But this morning, my necklace and bracelet were gone. They were gifts." The woman's eyes softened. "Have you eaten anything?" Diep shook her head. "Wait here," the woman said, already walking off, her footsteps quick. "I'll get you something." 10 minutes later, the woman returned with warm bread and a carton of milk. Diep hesitated, but hunger had long shed her pride. As she chewed, she whispered, "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to," the woman replied gently. "Just don't sleep out here again. It's dangerous." Diep blinked away the mist in her eyes. "It's still a long way home." "How far?" 150 kilometers. The woman looked at her with quiet disbelief. "And you're walking it?" Diep nodded. "Because someone is waiting for me." The wind picked up, and in its quiet howl, the night held its breath. Steam rose from the plastic bowl in Diep's hands, curling like ghosts of warmth against the chilly air. She cradled it as if it were sacred, because right now it was. Each spoonful tasted like memory, like the kitchen table she once knew, like being seen. The woman watched her eat, elbows on knees, chin resting in her hand, eyes thoughtful. "You really don't have to walk all that way," the woman said softly. "I could help you get a ride, or maybe even take you part of the way myself." Diep swallowed hard. "No, I can't trouble you more than I already have." "It's no trouble. You look like you've lost too much already." Diep looked down. The bracelets, the necklace, gone. They weren't worth much, maybe, but they were hers. And now all she had left was the road, her aching legs, and a name, James. "He's waiting for me," she murmured. The woman nodded, as if understanding the weight of a name could be enough to carry someone 150 kilometers. "I used to believe love like that only lived in books," the woman said, "but you're out here proving it's real." Diep smiled faintly, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills. "Please take this, for the food." The woman pushed her hand back gently. "No, you keep it. You'll need it more than I do." They sat like that for a while, two strangers sharing the same silence, bound by nothing but the softness of shared humanity. Then Diep stood. "I have to go," she said, eyes steady. The woman nodded. "Then walk strong, and don't forget who's waiting." James sat motionless on the weathered bench just outside the search perimeter, his tailored coat barely shielding him from the mountain breeze. Around him, the search team packed up. Dogs rested. Radios crackled faintly and then fell quiet. It had been 7 days. 7 days of forests, dead ends, and disappointment. "She's not here," the officer said, crouching beside him. "We've searched every meter. If she were, we'd have found her." James nodded, but his eyes were locked on the tree line. "Maybe she moved. Maybe she's still running. She's strong," his friend added. "She's from the countryside. People like her know how to survive." James didn't answer immediately. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching slightly as if reaching for something invisible. A memory, perhaps. The way she smiled when holding her children. The way her voice steadied when she spoke about building a new life. "I should have done more," he said quietly. "Should have stopped John sooner." "You did what you could." "No," James replied, his voice hollow. "I let things slide. I tried to be kind to a man who deserved justice, and now she's the one paying for it." A long pause followed. The forest whispered in dry leaves. "You still think she'll come back?" James didn't blink. "I don't know, but if she does, I'll be here." His friend placed a hand on his shoulder. "You need to return to your life, your company. You've done enough." James finally looked up, his eyes tired but unwavering. "No," he said, "not until I know she's safe." And the forest held its silence as if listening. In a room dimmed by dusk and heavy thoughts, James poured himself a glass of water he wouldn't drink. The soft murmurs of the city outside barely touched the stillness around him. A friend leaned against the wall, arms crossed, studying him with quiet concern. "You've spent so much time looking for her," the friend said. "What about your business, your life?" James gave a faint, dry laugh. "I've left everything to my secretary. I can't think about anything else right now, not until I find her." A pause. "I want to marry her," he said, almost to himself. "It's not just love, it's something I've never felt before." The friend straightened. "You're serious?" James nodded slowly. "More than ever. But it's not just her, it's the children too. They're not mine by blood, but I've thought this through. I can't love her without loving them. Completely. As if they were my own." His friend hesitated. "That's not a small choice, James. You'll face judgment. People will talk. Your board may question it. I know. But they didn't ask to be born into this. They didn't choose a father who vanished and a mother who had to survive. But I can choose. I can choose to stand by them, to be the man they deserve." The friend was quiet for a moment, then said, "You'll need more than love. You'll need strength, forgiveness, patience." James looked up, eyes tired but unwavering. "Then I'll give all of it, as long as she comes back, as long as I get the chance." A gust of wind moved the curtain gently, like breath returning to a room that had been waiting. The sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting golden patterns on the tiled floor. Inside the modest home, Mai sat beside Lee's sister, her hands nervously clasped in her lap. She had just graduated. Youth clung to her like morning dew. Her eyes wandered occasionally to the staircase, waiting for Lee to come down. "You're prettier every time I see you," the sister beamed. "You and Lee would make such a perfect match." Mai smiled faintly, unsure. "I care about him. I just don't want to lose him. That's why I'm afraid." "He's always working," the sister sighed. "But he's not seeing anyone. You're the only one he talks about." Footsteps echoed. Ly entered the room, neat in a buttoned shirt, eyes guarded but kind. "Hello, Mai," he greeted politely. She stood. "I came to visit. I just wanted to talk." His sister nudged playfully. "She's waiting for you to propose, you know." Ly chuckled awkwardly but looked at Mai with honest eyes. "I think we still need time. We've barely gotten to know each other." Mai nodded slowly. "I want to stay near you, not rush. Just be close enough to grow something real." Their conversation unfolded gently, each word carrying more weight than its sound. Outside, birdsong punctuated the silence. The sister pressed again. "You're 30, Ly. Don't wait too long." "I know," he said, but his gaze lingered on Mai. "Some things take time. I want to build love, not chase it." In that room, love hadn't bloomed yet, but it had been planted. And in silence, sometimes that was enough. The forest was still. The search teams had packed their gear, and only the lingering smell of sweat and soil remained. Under the gray canopy of morning light, an officer stood before Diep's family, hat in hand. "We've done all we can," he said solemnly. 7 days, every trail, every riverbank, there's no trace left to follow, we'll be calling off the search, at least within this province." Diep's mother bowed slightly, her face pale and hollowed by sleepless nights. "Thank you for trying." James stood beside her, jaw clenched, eyes locked somewhere past the tree line, as if willing her figure to appear. "We'll keep searching," he said. "We'll expand to the next province. If she's alive, she's still walking." The officers exchanged glances. One approached and said quietly, "Mr. James, you've done more than most. Maybe it's time to let go." But James shook his head. "She walked this far for me. I won't stop now." Later, in the shelter of his truck, he stared at a small, wrinkled photo of Diep holding her children. They were laughing, sunlight catching her hair like fire. "She didn't come back because she doesn't know John's gone," he whispered. "She thinks she's still in danger." His friend beside him sighed. "You could be right, but how much longer can you wait?" James looked out at the winding road, at the sky bleeding into pale blue. "As long as it takes." Even when the forest gave no answer, James chose to stay behind, not to chase hope blindly, but to hold it steady, like a flame cupped in tired hands. The road stretched endlessly before her, cracked asphalt winding through golden fields and scattered trees. Diep walked with the weight of exhaustion in her bones and the faint tremble of hunger still humming in her limbs. Her shoes, worn thin, no longer cushioned her steps, but her eyes carried fire. She had traded nothing but gratitude for every meal, a bowl of noodles, a carton of milk, a place to rest, if only for minutes. Kind strangers passed through her life like stars, brief and distant, but it was James who remained like the North Star, constant, silent, pulling her forward. She whispered once, not to anyone, but to herself, "James, wait for me." A truck rumbled past, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She didn't wave, didn't ask for a ride. This journey, this penance, was hers to finish. She had walked this far with nothing but hope and memory. The loss of her bracelet, her necklace, they hurt, but none of them hurt like leaving James without goodbye. Ahead, a weathered sign read, "Still 100 kilometers to go." She smiled, tired but unbroken. Behind her, the sun was sinking, casting long shadows that stretched like ghosts, but she didn't look back. "I'm coming home," she breathed. "Even if it's 1,500 kilometers, I'll come home to you." In the distance, a single bird crossed the sky, wings wide in quiet triumph, and Diep, one foot in front of the other, stepped into that twilight with a heart that remembered who she was walking for. Not to run, not to hide, but to return. Diep, a young woman, was kidnapped and forced to escape through the forest. After fleeing, she lost all her belongings and walked 150 kilometers to return home. Along the way, a kind stranger offered her food and help, but Diep insisted on continuing, knowing that James, the man she loves, was waiting. Meanwhile, James, a CEO, desperately searched for her, even after the police called off the search. He longed to marry Diep and love her 2 children as his own. Interwoven is the story of another couple just beginning, highlighting the contrast between love that's blooming and love that's been interrupted. In the end, Diep keeps walking, through dust and hunger, holding tightly to hope and memory, toward the place she calls home.